Hello, everybody. Welcome back. We've got what is this? This is our fourth session of the day, I think. Summer Community Day here in TLDC land. And I'm very excited to introduce you to Heidi Kirby, who has actually been on TLD casts in the past. I think you actually did one with Kara North, I believe, and super impressed with that conversation that you have. And I'm also always impressed with when I see you posting on LinkedIn, just how much you help other people with your career. And then you talk about on your block podcast, which maybe you might want to drop a link to that, Heidi, in the chat with you about where your podcast can be found. I love listening to that. I have it. I'm subscribed on Spotify to it, and I do check it out every once in a while. In fact, one of our other speakers later on today, I think I heard Sarah was through your podcast. So, yes. So thanks for that. Anyway, so Heidi is going to be talking about finding yourself in failure. Heidi is a manager learning solutions at DataTrack International. She knows her stuff, and she is especially been so generous about providing advice for people about their L&D career. See it all the time. So Heidi, with that, I'm going to let you take it away. I'm going to hide myself. I'll pop in if anything comes up, like any questions, Q&As, things like that. I'll jump back in and let you know. Okay.
Great. Thank you. Awesome. Well, first of all, I'm super excited to be here. This is an awesome lineup of speakers, and I'm really honored to be included in this lineup. What we're going to talk about today is not necessarily groundbreaking. It's not, kind of unique in any way, but my hope is that by talking a little bit about my experience with failure, that you hear something that maybe you needed to hear today, but maybe didn't know it. So like Luis kind of said and started out with, I started my career actually as a college English professor, teaching all over Northeast Ohio. And then I eventually made the career transition about 4 years ago to corporate instructional design. And I just started my first ever role as a L&D manager of a small yet scrappy team here in Cleveland, Ohio, where I'm from. And that is where I currently am manager of learning solutions. I'm also pursuing a PhD in instructional design and technology with Old Dominion. And as Luis said, also, I host the Block podcast, which I dropped a link to in the chat. And I would love to connect with all of you on LinkedIn. Go ahead and search for me, find me on LinkedIn. I love networking with other L&D people. And, if we aren't connected already, please go find me and connect with me on LinkedIn. So I don't want to spend a lot of time today talking about the definition of failure because the dictionary definition is technically lack of success. And we're just going to leave it at that because you've all felt failure in some way, shape, or form in your life. I don't need to define that for you. This poor sap on here is experiencing a little bit of everyday failure, but there's all kinds of different failures, right? So from personal to financial to relationship, things like that, academic, career, but we're going to keep it in the career professional realm today because that's what we're here to talk about, career development. And so I want to talk about a few different ways that failure can help us. So failure can teach us where knowledge and skill gaps are. It can also help us to kind of assess our own personality and find some of our strengths that we maybe didn't realize were there. And we can also look back on past failures and leverage those for future success. So first of all, I want to talk about the lessons that failure teaches us. And if you wouldn't mind, if you could just drop in the chat, what is your favorite video game, mobile game, or if you're not an electronic gamer, board game, card game, whatever, of all time? I'd love to hear. Oh, Kara, Knights of the Old Republic. I spent so much time playing that when it came out for Xbox. Diablo, Cards Against Humanity. I love it. Oh, Rummy. This is great. Awesome. Sims on there. Exploding kittens. That's great. Old school PC games. Oh, this is great. So I have a couple. I couldn't really choose between all of the different games. I narrowed it down to like 2 all-time favorites. And that is Zelda Link's Awakening for original Game Boy and Super Mario 64 for Nintendo 64. Those are like my top 2 of all-time games. But if we think about games and video games, they're by design having us fail to teach us something, right? And so, you're running along as your little character and you are trying to jump over the ravine, right? And it doesn't work. And so next time you double jump and okay, you get across the ravine, but right after that, you get hit by a poison dart, right? And so sometimes when you're playing those video games, it feels like, oh my gosh, I've died 12 times in the last 15 minutes and just kept course correcting. And failing in video games is kind of a lot like failing in life in that way, right? So if we look at the areas where we fail, it can show us a skill or a knowledge gap that maybe we didn't realize that we had or didn't realize was as bad as we thought it was. So for me, last spring, I failed my written comprehensive exams for my PhD program. That was a massive failure because I had to retake my comps. And so I had to figure out and go through the process of with my department talking about what was it exactly that I failed on. And as it turns out, I am terrible at planning a research study, at writing out, what methodology should look like. And that would make sense. A lot of my other colleagues in the program have published research and I don't. And so it was really clear to me what I was missing. And so it was really clear what knowledge gap I needed to fill to be able to go ahead and pass my comps the second time around. And I did because I was able to address that specific failure. But sometimes failure can also show us something where if there's a pattern of mistakes, right? So for instance, maybe we are ending up at these organizations that just don't fit what we thought they would be, or just don't fit our personality, or, we keep being unsatisfied with our job or our position. And, we're like, why does this keep happening? And if we look back on it, maybe it's the fact that we're not finding out when we first sign on to work with a certain organization, we're not finding out if they value the same things that we do. We're not asking about work-life balance. We're not asking about all these different things. And so I think that it can be really important to kind of look for those patterns of why does this keep happening so that we can really kind of learn from those failures. The second thing that failure teaches is that it exposes us. So, fun fact, Henry Ford was actually supposed to take over his family's farm. And it wasn't until his mother passed away that he left and decided to become an engineer. And so I want you to think for a second, imagine if one move that you made that was a product of failure didn't happen. Would you still be where you are today? Would you still be in the place where you are now? And so what does failure teach us about our personality and about the strengths that we do have? Sometimes we fail because we're not blank enough, whatever that blank is. But what's the opposite of that? Is that something that we can leverage as a strength? For example, if I tried to have a career in sales, I would be terrible. Sales is like my, if you have like your dream job or your dream career, sales is the absolute opposite of that. Sales is my nightmare job. I am not aggressive enough. So if you're finding somewhere that you're feeling like, oh my gosh, I'm just not blank enough. Well, what's the opposite of that? I find that I'm a lot more reserved and I avoid conflict. I would rather support someone than have an argument or have a difficult conversation. And that lends itself really well to kind of my leadership and my management style, right? That support and how I act as a coach. So if we look at the areas where we're like, wow, I'm not blank enough. Well, is the opposite of that something that we're strong at? And is that something that we can foster and something that we can talk about and leverage? Also, we can look back at how we've reacted to failure in the past to see where, just in that reaction, where we were strong. Now, I mean, sometimes it depends on how you react to failure, right? I mean, if you are the kind of person who finds out that your area of strength is brute physical force because you flipped a table when you found out about a failure, then that's one thing. But I'm sure that there are times where you've experienced failure where you were able to stay calm, where you are able to be resilient or persistent and keep going and keep trying. And in my own experience, I looked back and realized that I have a lot of compassion as a person, because when I was laid off from my job last spring due to COVID, of course, it sucked for me, but I was also worried about the other people that I had worked with that had been laid off, my former coworkers. Some of them were single parents. Some of them had lost their health benefits when they were laid off and lost their financial stability, right? And so I found myself worried about them. I was helping people look at resumes because they hadn't updated their resume in 15, 20 years because this was the only position they had. And so if we kind of look back and assess how some of those positive reactions that we've had to failure, we can kind of see areas that we can leverage as a strength moving forward. Failure also shows us success. So James Dyson, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Dyson vacuum cleaner. James Dyson actually went through 5,126 vacuum designs before he created a working one. That's just a working, functional design. That wasn't even the final design that he ended up using. It was just one that was created a functional vacuum cleaner. And now James Dyson, not the company, the human being, James Dyson is worth $9.7 billion. So we can take our points of failure, our quote unquote rock bottoms, if you will, right? And we can show them to others to compare where we were then and where we are now and how far we've come. That's one of the biggest ways that I see failure kind of leveraged, especially, in job interviews or in jobs, in stories about failure. I went from editing PowerPoints and adding commas in the right place. And as one of my coworkers so kindly said about me, making things pretty. I'm sure you guys have heard something similar to that in your experience. To now managing an L&D team and managing an L&D function for an organization. And, being able to talk about that, how far you've come, is always something, a great way to make things positive. But also, I think we can learn to leverage spinning our failures a little bit better, right? So, you think of a media spin, right? They always spin the stories to sound a certain way, right? And how can we take that same thing and frame our failure to show growth? So, for instance, I like to say when people point out that I failed my comps and then had to retake them, well, how many people do you know who have taken a written comprehensive exam for a PhD program twice? Because if you know what a gauntlet that kind of is to get through once, then knowing, having the resilience to get through it twice is a lot. I can say, hey, resilience is one of my strengths, and this is why I took my PhD comps not once, but twice, right? Getting laid off during the pandemic. I at first I was super ashamed, and I was like, oh my gosh, I can't talk about this. I don't want anyone to know. I don't want there to be any gaps in employment. You go through all that negative self-talk in your head. But I was able to find a contract position. And then I was able to find my current position this past January. And so now I'm like, man, I found not one, but 2 jobs during a global pandemic. How many people can say that, right? So, if you were laid off during the pandemic and you found a new job, leverage that. Not only was I laid off during a pandemic, but I was able to find another job during a time of global crisis, right? And the confidence that that's given me that now I'm not so worried anymore about job security, right? Now I can focus more on a good organizational fit because I'm not so desperate to whatever organization accepts my resume, I'll take it, because I now feel more confident that I can find a job if I need to, right? And if I hadn't have had that failure in my life, if I hadn't have lost my job, I might not be managing an L&D team today, right? So a lot of what we've talked about so far is this kind of how we react to failure and how we reflect back on failure. And that's all well and good, but this kind of assumes that we have a positive reaction to failure when it happens. And I don't want to give that impression because I don't have a positive reaction to failure when it happens. And I wouldn't expect anybody else to either. So here are some of my tips for reacting to failure. First and foremost, for better or for worse, other people's opinions do not matter when it comes to our failures, right? So I had a former coworker of mine who said some pretty nasty things about me to another coworker. And I found out about it through the grapevine. But there was this long list of failures to justify why I shouldn't be in the position that I was in. Things that were on that list of my quote unquote failures included things like that I wasn't done with my PhD program yet, and that I had a child. So that meant that my attention would not be fully on the position. So number one, I'm a semester behind in my PhD program. I'm kind of on track. I'm still within the average 4 to 5 years of completing my PhD program. So I'm not really sure why that was still pursuing my PhD was something to point out. And I'm not really sure how having children has anything to do with my work performance. But all that to say, other people don't get to decide what your failures are in life, right? You don't have to answer to that. You don't have to listen to that negativity when you hear it of, oh, well, maybe I should have my PhD done already. Maybe I'm not doing this right. Just, shut those people out. Go find your Zen place. And yeah, like Kara said, tell them to go sit on a cactus. And most importantly, take time to grieve your loss. A lot of times, failure in a professional setting is associated with some type of loss, right? It might be loss of job, loss of financial stability, loss of, job opportunity. Maybe you interviewed for your dream job and you were down to the final 2 and you didn't get it. I hear that all the time from people. These are all examples of loss. If someone you knew had a personal loss and then they just simply did not grieve it, you would think that was weird and you would worry about them, right? So if you have some type of what you feel is a catastrophic professional failure, take time to grieve that loss. When I was laid off, when I failed my comps, these photos on the screen, binged Netflix, ate ice cream, and went on hikes with my family because Those are the things that I do to find comfort. Those are the things that I do to recharge. Those are the things that I do when I want to get away, right? Take time to do those things. Now, of course, you have to kind of like find that fine balance between allowing yourself time to grieve or, wallowing in self-pity, right? You don't want to go that far. And sometimes it can be kind of, a little weird to find that balance, but take time. The day I failed my comps, I texted my boss who knew I was waiting on these results. And I was like, yeah, so I failed and I don't think I can focus today. Would it be okay if I took the rest of the day off? And he was like, yeah, of course. And so I just went into my little basement cave and binged Netflix for the rest of the day because I just wanted to take my mind off of it, right? And that's okay to do, right? And it's also important to treat yourself nicely, right? Show yourself compassion. I need to be better about this. And so it's something that's really important to me is being able to treat ourselves with the same compassion that we treat other people with. If a friend of mine came to me and said, I lost my job, would I respond with, wow, what is your family going to do? You literally, you're totally screwing over and failing your whole family because now they're not going to be financially stable. And how are you going to pay your car payment? How are you going to pay your mortgage? What is wrong with you? How could you lose this job? What did you do? I would never, ever speak to a loved one that way, right? But that's what I told myself. When if you have a friend who is going for a job and they make it to the final two and they don't get the job, do you say, wow, you really messed that one up. You really biffed that. How are you going to ever find a company that you like to work for if you keep doing that? No, you would never talk to your friend like that. So why do we think it's okay to speak to ourselves that way? Why do we think it's okay to, just really dig in and, self-abuse ourselves when we have failure? It's not okay. You need to show yourself that compassion. You need to say, okay, what would I tell someone else if they were in my shoes? And tell yourself that. You would say things like, you are brilliant and talented. No worries. You are going to find a job because you're awesome. Or for that friend who didn't get the job they were going for, you would say something like, you know what? If they don't like you, forget them. They're missing out. They're the ones that are losing out on a great, wonderful person. But, we're our own worst critics. So if you're not there yet, if you're not able to show yourself compassion, in closing, I just want to say, if somebody hasn't told you lately, you have what it takes to do this. You have what it takes to get through failure. You got this. And you have people who support you and who love you and who are rooting for you and who are cheering for you, even just within this community of TLDC. You have people that are wanting you to succeed, right? And so if sometimes you can't talk to yourself nicely, at least let everybody else support you. Thanks.